schedule. So I want to get started on H167. This is the bill that we took a little bit of, well, we heard yesterday from Food Bank, right? So just setting up the grant program for Vermonters feeding Vermonters. The agency plays a role in the bill as introduced at any rate. So we're hoping that you can give us, give us the agency's perspective. Anything else you'd like to say about the bill? Trevor, were you going to speak first, or?
The poll is going to start, and then
Okay.
I'll come in after.
Okay.
Sure.
All right. Well, we can go ahead and get started then.
Okay. For the record, Nicole Dubuque, I am the Chief Operating Officer for the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and I'm joined by Trevor Lowell, who's the Assistant Director of our Agricultural Development Division. So I'm happy to just start with our position on the bill from what we've read thus far, and then I would love if there's an opportunity to kind of ask questions and hear a little bit more about the thought process behind it. So H167, the Vermonters Feeding Vermonters grant program, ultimately, we at the agency conceptually agree with the bill. I think anytime that we can buy more local food and build up our food system in Vermont, that's great. Also, I will just acknowledge that it was, a tight budget year, and we understand that there are also priorities such as housing and education, and we're acknowledging that housing is a big factor in being able to maintain workforce in the agriculture sector. So that is also beneficial to us. I just want to name that. A question that I have that I guess I'll just say right off the bat that I was a little bit curious about is it appears that the funding would come through the Agency of Agriculture to be granted to the food bank, and then the food bank would do sub-awards. Is that correct?
Well, let's see. I've got the page 3 of the bill in front of me, and this is, if you committee members want to pull this up as well.
Is it easy to access?
Yeah, you can just find the
H167.
Yeah. So you're on page 3, are you, Nicole?
I am actually it is on page 3 again, but I was primarily looking at the overview on page 1, I think, that it says the bill proposes to establish within the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, the Vermonters Feeding Vermonters grant program to provide grants to Vermont Food Bank to purchase local food to distribute through the Vermont Food Bank's distribution channels, and for Vermont Food Bank to offer sub-grants to Vermont Food Bank community partners.
Yes. So we heard testimony from, and that's essentially that same language is on page 3. That is in the actual statutory change. And we did hear testimony from the food bank that they typically would be buying from large farmers directly, but then when they want to buy from a smaller farmer with, say, less than a pallet, they wouldn't normally do that directly themselves. So in normal course of business, this is an existing program, Vermonters Feeding Vermonters, they would make a sub-grant to one of the organizations that they work with, one of their partners, and that those partners then would be the ones dealing directly with the farmers.
Okay.
Smaller farmers.
Yeah. So I think ultimately our position here is that conceptually we're okay with the bill, but follow-up questions for sure. And I know that Trevor's here and he could probably answer any of the questions that you have about how a program like this would work in his division. My immediate question would be, and apologies, I did not see the testimony yesterday with the food bank, is is there a specific reason why the money should come through our agency to the food bank and not to the food bank directly?
Um, well, I don't know that I'm prepared to answer that question. So.
Okay, and
But
sorry
that's,
to put you on the spot.
we'll put the question, yeah, we'll put the question out there. That's a good question.
Okay. Yeah, so I think, it's a fairly short and straightforward bill. I think our main concerns or questions would be about actually administering it in-house, because, full disclosure, we're at capacity, and it looks like it would add additional needs as far as grants and contract staff to develop and monitor the agreement, as well as additional capacity in our business office to make the payments. And then I think Trevor has some questions and some information about like data collection and what we do right now and what the committee would be looking for as far as reporting and collecting of data so that we could understand the amount of capacity we would need.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. Should we have Trevor come up then?
That would be great.
All right, good morning. Thanks, Chair Durfee, thanks committee members. For the record, I'm Trevor Lowell. I'm the Assistant Director of the Agricultural Development Division in the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. It's a long title. So in my role, I help oversee our development division. We run a number of grant programs, manage lots of contracts, and generally support the ag industry through economic development with a variety of state funds, federal funds, and other funding sources. So what is described in this bill is well within our wheelhouse of the type of work that we do on a regular basis, the type of thing that we're very adept at. And I guess I would just stop there and invite any questions, or if there's specific things you'd like me to speak to, I'm happy to do that. As Nicole mentioned, I did have a chance to see some of the testimony and go through the bill here. So I think a lot of this is in the details when we think about the capacity issue, but would just be happy to answer any questions or kind of carry forward with.
So are you best equipped to answer the operational questions or logistical questions? Is that?
Yeah, so our team manages we have a grants and contracts team within the development division, and then we have a business office which lives within the administrative division of the ag agency. So the grants and contracts, that internal team does a lot of the writing of the grants and contracts, the actual collecting of W-9s, certificates of insurance, but then they interface with our business office, which is making the payments, interfacing with division, the state's payment system. So there's a lot of people involved in that, but I certainly can speak to kind of how this might be operationalized and any questions.
Yeah. So getting back to Nicole's question about why funnel this through the agency as opposed to directly appropriating it to the food bank. Nicole, had you and I haven't spoken about this. Had you had any conversations with the food bank or with folks who are working on the bill about that?
I have not personally been reached out to. I don't know if Trevor or perhaps Abby Willard have. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay. I think there was I don't want to say concern, but a question about whether an appropriation directly to any organization was the right approach as opposed to going through an agency and having an agency be responsible for administering it. So beyond that, I really don't know that I can speak to it or say anything more that would be accurate.
Okay.
Representative O'Brien.
This is part of the $5 million ask.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, it is part of that. So I guess one question is, and you alluded to staffing, can you speak at all to the amount of staff time that would be required if the agency were involved?
Yeah, and I may kind of come at this from the questions around how this gets operationalized and the nuances there. One thing is called out in the bill is the reporting requirement that would be the responsibility of our agency. That could be very straightforward depending on how those details are worked out. So the food bank, we've been a strong partner for many years. We've had grants and agreements with them. And often what we'll do in this situation is we'll put the onus of collecting that data, providing that information, tracking the sales, tracking the locations on the grantee as part of that agreement. So if the food bank is simply, they're doing the heavy lifting of, tracking that, collecting that information and handing it to us, the burden of providing that report could be very low. It could be simply kind of taking that information, putting it into a, official agency document and sharing it with you all. If it's the ag agency's responsibility to go out and track all of the sub-grant activity, all of the volume, all of the distribution, that's a lot more work on our end. So I think the food bank is very good at this. And I could imagine a scenario where, it would be appropriate and it would be part of, precedent for other agreements we've had in the past where as part of their grant agreement, it would be their responsibility to track all that information and share it with us. And we could, play a role in monitoring that, working with them to verify that. But, that's part of this capacity concern. Again, you could imagine two different scenarios. One would take a lot more staff time to kind of track all those things down and compile all that information. Some other capacity considerations around kind of, is this a one-time agreement on an annual basis? Or are we really, how much involvement would we have in the sub-grant process? I think if it's a one-time agreement, there's also precedent for that. We do that with the Sustainable Jobs Fund and Vermont Farm to Plate on an annual basis. We had an example with Salvation Farms, which is the 501c3 that does a lot of gleaning and recovery of Vermont grown produce, where we, very similar situation, money was appropriated to the ag agency. We then formed a grant with Salvation Farms. So we do that quite often, and there is undoubtedly work for our staff to design those agreements, manage those payments, collect all the required information for sure. But that's kind of one end of the spectrum. Another end of the spectrum would be, multiple grants throughout the year or, heavy involvement in the sub-granting process that, as you move along that spectrum, you put more and more demands on the ag agency, our team, and the business office as well. So it's difficult to kind of quantify given the level of detail in here, but would just encourage as the conversation continues to be thinking about like there is a lot of nuance there. And as those details get filled in, it could really increase the capacity or the demands on our capacity, or, again, it could be a much more straightforward situation.
Yeah. Representative O'Brien.
Trevor, can you just speak about how the agency stood up the meat maple produce because it was this per se amount of money? Was there capacity there? Or, is there a tail to it now that you're finding, we could have used more staff or because you saw it coming, you managed it comfortably?
Yeah, so that was part of the ag development appropriation, ag development grants. And I believe, and Nicole, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was administrative funds provided with that. So we were able to, support the grant program with additional staff and staff time that was provided in that appropriation. I don't see that language in this bill here, but it took, those types of grant programs, the ADG grants, very different animal, we had 400 applicants for the meat and maple program. So you just imagine the volume of trying to review all of those applications, score them, do an objective review process to determine who should be awarded. That's a very different scenario than, a hypothetical where we're maybe doing one agreement with one entity. It's not a competitive process, so we don't have to run, an open competitive grant program. So I think a relevant example, but like very different scenarios, I would say.
Quite different, I think, in the sense that this isn't intended to be competitive. And I think it's really you're supposed to serve as a conduit on the front end. There is the reporting requirement that's spelled out that does certainly add a level of not complexity, but more work. So maybe there's some work that we could do on that. If the agency was just serving as a conduit to supply a report that the food bank put together, maybe that would resolve a lot of the concern.
Yeah, and again, I think there's great partnership there. And a lot of times our role in that reporting is the accountability piece. It's making sure that that grantee or that contractor is doing what they're saying. So I think with the food bank, they are best positioned to really know how many trucks went to the site, how much volume of food was distributed. And then I think we could play an important role of, collecting that information, making sure that that's valid and that we feel confident in their numbers.
Okay. Other questions? Nicole?
Thank you, Chair. So I just wanted to add to what Trevor is saying, just for the committee's understanding. So one of the reasons why administrative funding or funding for administration is important and why it's important in Meet Maple Produce is because we have a lot of federal funding that goes through the Agricultural Development Division. And so many of our positions are limited service with specific federal funding for specific functions. And so even if we have the people, so to speak, if we bring in a new program and that position is federally funded, we can't just have them do this new programming unless we're able to replace some of the federal funding that is supporting the position, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
Okay.
Representative Nelson.
So trying to wrap my head and being new to this, if we were to take this on, this $5 million ask, almost like a portion of it needs to go to help fund a position across the street to manage the fund. Is that what we're looking at, Trevor or Nicole?
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Nicole.
Oh, no, I was just going to say yes. So essentially, because of what I was talking about with the braided funding, an example is if we have somebody in a position that is specifically funded through a USDA program, right? Unless we put some administrative funding towards their position or get a new position, then we wouldn't be able to just have them do this work if they're being paid for by USDA. So yes, it would be like a portion of the funding to support the administrative functions in our agency.
Something like 1%.
Again, I think it's in the details, right? Because if it's multiple grants and the reporting is there's a large amount of work around that, supporting that, it will fluctuate on what the staff demands are based on the details of the program.
Yeah, like a half-time position or a full-time or
Right.
or 1.25 or 4%, 40% or I don't know.
And that's something that exists within our division. We have positions that are split funded. So again, depending on that capacity and how much work it would take to administer this program, it could be a half-time FTE. Again, it's very much in the details.
Nicole, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, I was just going to say, typically what I've seen in, different funding streams, whether it comes federally or not, is that the amount for administrative costs out of the total appropriation is literally anywhere between 2 and 15%. So I was just going to say exactly what Trevor was saying, which is really depends on the scope of work.
Yeah. Representative O'Brien.
So Nicole, Secretary Tebbets the other day said that something like $7 million flows through the agency to the conservation districts as grants. So would this be a sort of a parallel to that where, it all depends on like how much detail work that say conservation districts have to do, or is there a lot for the agency to get that money to flow through and track it?
Yeah, so that goes through a different division, and I'd say the difference over there is that they are primarily state funds or Clean Water Board funds in the water quality division, and they do also have grants and contract staff. So yes, I think it's more about the conservation districts like doing that reporting and us doing some compiling versus having to go out and collect it ourselves. But I can absolutely get more information on that flow for you through water quality.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Representative Basil.
Yeah, just from hearing what was stated about this program the other day from the food bank, my impression is that they've already been doing work along these lines. And certainly my impression of the way this bill would work is that they would be doing the bulk of the work in terms of finding the farmers and making the matches, and maybe the sub-grants would be doing the micro level. But my impression was not that the Agency of Ag would be stuck with a huge administrative burden, but they would be doing the administrative burden, but they would be having the funds, come through them just as a channel in terms of part of the budget. And I guess I just wanted to name two. Richard actually just mentioned the number 5 million, but as far as I recall, the farmers, the Vermonters, Feeding Vermonters is actually a $2 million request. That's part of the 5 million for the food bank. So it's a little bit, it's a different subsection of funds that we're talking about for that. But my impression is that it shouldn't be, if there's a range of 2 to 15, it shouldn't be the 15 side. That was my impression.
Yes, I mean, I think that the intent here was not to shift any of the work onto the agency other than to create a channel that would allow the program to be funded in the way that we want it to be funded. Maybe that's not necessary. If it is necessary, I think the hope would be to have as little work as possible on the agency. I can't imagine there being a need to hire anybody, for one. But I can understand that if everyone currently employed in the agency is at capacity, that this would mean, doing something, whether it's signing a piece of paper once and then signing another piece of paper at the end of the year to pass along a report that's been submitted. But that's maybe the other extreme, and it would fall somewhere, along that spectrum. But I think the idea would not be a lot of work for the agency, and we wouldn't want it to be. So,
Is that something that we should amend the language here to reflect just?
Yes, right. So if there's any, concern on the agency's part about what exactly, they would be expected to do, we would want to amend the language to reflect that and make sure that everybody was comfortable with it. You asked Representative O'Brien about the conservation district grants. And I was going to ask whether there are any other examples of grants that just really pass through the agency and how those are structured, in terms of whether there is a percentage built into those typically.
Yeah, I think the two that I mentioned earlier with the Sustainable Jobs Fund, they receive an annual appropriation that's a pass-through from our agency. And then that example, that one-time grant to Salvation Farms, quite a large grant to help them build out some capacity and infrastructure. I don't know for sure, so I won't speak to whether there's administrative funds with that. But there's certainly precedent for us doing these one-time types of agreement or once a year type of agreement. And there's undoubtedly work associated with that. Again, it's all kind of on a continuum, right? I think those are pretty straightforward, but there's still, things like making sure we're complying with the state's procurement and contracting requirements, tracking those things. The Environmental Justice Act is kind of a new regulatory thing for us. We have to track a lot of things for that for certain programs. I don't know off the top of my head how that may impact something like that. But I think it's, just want to make that point of being considerate of, I think we could think of that continuum. And on one end, it's not a lot of a burden, but there's still work to be done. And on the other end, maybe there could be work to think about the details of the bill to ensure that, things like the reporting, most of that responsibility falls to the food bank and things like.
Yeah, I think we could get to that point and still acknowledge that no agency is going to sign off on something without making sure that you're complying with whatever other, statutory requirements there are, and just that it's all accurate if you're signing off on it. So,
Right.
Yeah, okay.
And then how does working lands granting happen? Because that's a line item in your budget.
Yeah, that's different in that those are competitive funds. So that money is provided and then the Working Lands has a board, so they're engaged as well, but that money is pushed out. Most of our programs are competitive in that way. And so there's a much larger burden with those programs just because you think of that process of the outreach, developing an RFA, running a competitive review program. So those come in, and there is administrative funding for that program. We have 2 staff that work full-time on Working Lands to manage that.
Right. Okay, this has been helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. And we'll have to put our heads together and we'll be back in touch.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Right, thank you.
WC.
If anybody needs to step out, we have more testimony coming right up, but is it live or is it?
Well, we're still live and they're.
Memorex.
Should we pause?
Do we have witnesses in the waiting room or are they coming in person?